I now call to order the Committee on House Administration for purposes of today's hearing on state voter registration list maintenance. The hearing record will remain open for 5 legislative days, so members may submit any materials they wish to include. A quorum is present, so we may proceed. I first would like to thank our witnesses for their appearance before the committee. Today's hearing addresses an important subject, both for our democracy and certainly for each of us as members. We are each uniquely dependent on states conducting accurate elections every 2 years. The accuracy of our elections is the bedrock upon which all of our work in the People's House lies. Therefore, it is paramount that every election be conducted in a fair and open manner. To that end, today we have asked our witnesses to testify on state voter registration list maintenance. Ensuring the accuracy of voter registration lists is the foundation to a successful election. Having accurate lists increases voter confidence, it eases the administration of elections, reduces wait times, and certainly helps prevent voter fraud and irregularity. The Bauer-Ginsburg Commission, headed by Bob Bauer, former President Barack Obama's campaign counsel and later White House counsel, and Ben Ginsburg, former President George W. Bush's campaign counsel and Mitt Romney's campaign counsel, noted this in the report, stating, and I quote, "Improving the accuracy of registration rolls, for example, can expand access, reduce administrative costs, prevent fraud and irregularity, and reduce polling place congestion leading to long lines." Many times, the work accomplished by our state and local election officials goes unsung. However, their work on ensuring the accuracy of voter rolls can clear the way for a better voting experience. It could both drive more citizens out to the polls and reduce voter fraud and irregularities. Voter list maintenance is the most important homework that each state and local election official needs to do. Under our Constitution, it is the responsibility of the states to run elections. Congress can pass legislation to place mandates on states concerning the time, places, and manner of elections, which includes voter list maintenance requirements. Congress has enacted these requirements in the National Voter Registration Act, or NVRA, and the Help America Vote Act. But the implementation of these requirements lies with states who have the ultimate responsibility for elections. Specifically, Section 8 of the NVRA requires that states conduct a general program that makes reasonable efforts to remove the names of ineligible voters from the official list. These laws were a product of legislative compromise, and each state has a responsibility to follow that law. The duties imposed by NVRA require critical functions in ensuring the accuracy and integrity of our elections. When states do fail to follow the law, problems arise. For example, it seems intuitive that states should not have more registered voters than citizens of voting age. However, the most recent election administration surveys indicate that 8 states have such problems. Even if states are given the benefit of the doubt that these inaccuracies are caused simply by voters moving out of a state and not canceling their previous registration, confidence in the election process is shaken and confusion at the polls can run rampant. As we review these laws and others that impact state voter registration lists, it's important to remember that our country has changed from when NVRA was initially adopted in 1993. Technology has changed. Many other things have taken place. There's been a number of profound changes over the years since the law was enacted, and it's worth examining the mandates of the NVRA and how states bring that law into effect. We must also recognize that the federal government is the partner of the states in list maintenance. We need to hear how the federal government can provide appropriate access of federal databases to further their list maintenance efforts. For example, does the Social Security Death Index provide the appropriate information to states? How can the federal government improve the information sharing between states concerning residents while recognizing that states have already banded together and created programs to do so? These are some of the important issues that are essential to our democracy. And on these specific points that I have mentioned, I want to again thank Indiana Secretary of State and President of the National Association of Secretaries of State, Connie Lawson, for her hard work on this issue and for agreeing to be here to testify. And I now recognize Ranking Member Brady for any opening statement that he may wish to give.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for calling this hearing, and I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. I will have a longer statement for the record, so I'll just make a few comments now. The National Voter Registration Act, or Motor Voter Law, has added an estimated 300 million new voters on the rolls. It was a common sense idea. If you need to access a government service, you should be reminded to vote. It was that simple principle that inspired me to introduce the Automatic Voter Registration Act of 2017, which expanded the Motor Voter Act. But we need to carefully maintain voter lists. In maintaining these lists, we need to have one principle. No one who has lawfully registered to vote should be kicked off the rolls to keep them from voting. For example, the Ohio Secretary of State was using a process of list maintenance that involved canceling registrants of individuals who had not voted since 2008. That should not have happened. Again, I'd like to thank the chairman for calling this hearing, and I look forward to the witness's testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Brady. Chair will now recognize Mr. Raskin for the purposes of an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much, and thanks for calling this really important hearing. I appreciate it, and thank you also to the ranking member, Mr. Brady, for his leadership on these election issues. One of our great presidents spoke of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I think that beautiful, tantalizing ideal expresses what we want to think of as democracy in America. Of course, we didn't start that way. We started as a slave republic of white male property owners over the age of 21. The vast majority of people couldn't vote. And it's only been through political struggle and constitutional changes that we've opened America up to voting by everybody for the expression of the popular will. So the 15th Amendment banned race discrimination in voting. The 14th Amendment established equal protection. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. The 17th Amendment shifted the mode of election of U.S. senators from the legislatures to the people. The 24th Amendment banned poll taxes in elections. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. So we've opened democracy up to full participation by the people. But even when we have these formal constitutional changes, we know that there have been repeated efforts to nullify the vote with things like the literacy test, the poll tax, grandfather clauses, obstacles to registration, difficulties imposed on the path to voting, and so on. So on the one hand, nothing is more American than the ideal of one person, one vote that was articulated in Reynolds versus Sims, Harper versus Virginia Board of Elections, a series of cases that established the right of everybody to vote. On the other hand, we also know that it's pretty American to see impulses, or the impulse expressed in different places, to disenfranchise people through behind-the-scenes political manipulation dressed up as bureaucratic extremism. And in our times, we've seen a lot of people disenfranchised through governmental efforts that were later discredited and found to be completely illegitimate. I think a lot about the contested presidential election that took place in Florida in 2000, where the Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, ordered a purge of the voter rolls to get rid of people who might be convicted felons, and contracted out for more than $1 million to a private party to do that. And there was a memo written back to her saying, well, we're getting some near matches, but the middle names are different. We're not quite right. There's a junior in one place, not in another. And she wrote back, cast a wide net. And it came out in hearings after the election took place that more than 17,000 people were unlawfully denied the right to vote in Florida there. And we've seen lots of cases like that where there have been efforts to disenfranchise populations, often targeted in minority communities, through bureaucratic efforts that are later determined to be imperfect. So when I think about this, Mr. Chairman, I think a lot about William Blackstone's famous comment that in a free society it's better that 10 guilty persons escape punishment than one innocent person be sent to prison. And I think about voting, is it better to disenfranchise 1,000 people who are legitimate bona fide voters in order to get one person whose name may have appeared in the same place in two different jurisdictions and might decide to engage in the ludicrous activity of trying to commit voter fraud by voting in two different places, which we know is extremely rare. So I just want to make sure as we go about this, I totally agree with you that we want accuracy, we want integrity in the voting process, but we don't want a voting process that actually works against the interests of the voter. So I'll be very interested to hear what our witnesses have to say about that, and I welcome them today. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I would now like to introduce our witnesses for today. Connie Lawson serves as Indiana's 61st Secretary of State. She served in that capacity since 2012. Prior to her service as Secretary of State, she served for 16 years in the Indiana Senate, where she was the first woman to serve as Majority Floor Leader. Before joining the Indiana Senate, she served as the clerk of the Hendrick County Circuit Court. Secretary Lawson currently serves as the president of NAS, National Association of Secretaries of State. She is also an honorary governor of the Richard Lugar Public Service Series, an honorary chairwoman of the Lupus Foundation of Indiana, and co-chair of the Hendricks County United Way. Del Ho is the director of the ACLU's Voting Rights Project and supervises the ACLU's voting rights litigation and advocacy work nationwide. His current cases include Husted versus A. Philip Randolph Institute, a voter list maintenance case pending before the U.S. Supreme Court. Dale is also an adjunct professor of law at NYU School of Law and Brooklyn Law School. He is a graduate of Yale Law School and Princeton University. The committee has received your written testimony. You'll each have 5 minutes to offer and present a summary of that submission. As you know, to help you keep the time, you see the lights on the desk. So it'll be green for 4 minutes, yellow for the last minute, and when time is expired, it'll turn red, so that would mean it's time to bring it in for a landing at that point. The chair now recognizes Secretary Lawson for the purposes of her opening statement for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Well, good morning, Chairman Harper, Vice Chairman Davis, and Ranking Member Brady. I'm very honored to be here with you this morning and to address you. Voter list maintenance is needed because approximately 24 million, or 1 out of every 8 voter registrations in the United States are no longer valid or are significantly inaccurate, according to the 2012 study by the Pew Center. The National Voter Registration Act of 1993 requires the removal of inaccurate voter registration records, but with multiple safeguards to protect voters. In most cases, before a registration record may be canceled, the record must be identified as showing an inaccurate current address for the voter. Only after 2 federal elections have taken place, up to 4 years, and only if the voter has not confirmed during those 4 years that the record is in fact accurate, can the voter registration record be canceled as required by this federal law. Simple failure to vote never causes a registration record to be canceled. Cancellation only occurs if the registration contains inaccurate information, which indicates that the voter is no longer qualified to vote at that address. Local election administrators in Indiana's 92 counties, who are most familiar with their voters and communities, perform voter list maintenance daily by updating information on voters who have moved, died, or requested that the registration be canceled. However, many counties do not have the money to do the periodic and uniform mailings that the voters that are required by federal law. Thus, the state has taken the lead. This process begins when the state mails all Indiana voters a postcard. Some are returned due to an unknown or insufficient address. The state mails these voters a second forwardable postcard, asking the voter to provide us with updated information. If the voter responds, their county updates their information and no further action is needed. If they do not respond to either mailing, the record is marked inactive. Once a record is marked inactive, it is not removed from the list unless the voter misses the next 2 federal elections or otherwise fails to confirm their address is in fact correct. The voter is still eligible to vote during this 4-year period. If the voter casts a ballot from that address during any election in that 4-year period, the primary, the general, or the special, their record is automatically returned to an active status. In 2014, Indiana undertook voter list maintenance using this statewide mailing process. Inactive registrations remained on the rolls for 2014, 2015, 2016. Records that were still inactive at the end of that period were canceled in 2017. As of today, 481,235 voter registrations have been canceled through this process. Voter list maintenance reduces election costs. Counties with bloated voter rolls are forced to spend more money to purchase extra equipment, secure additional locations, and pay for election workers. Allowing invalid registrations to remain on the rolls distorts the reality of actual voter participation and turnout. In 2016, the official voter turnout in Indiana was 58% of all registered voters, despite a record number of voters turning out to vote. If the voter list maintenance conducted this year in 17 had taken place before the 2016 election, Indiana's turnout would have been about 65%. Voter list maintenance also boosts voter confidence in our election system. I often hear from poll workers and county officials that voters are disturbed by seeing the name of a deceased family member or neighbor still on the list years after death or moving away. As I close, I want to address the uncertainty that clouds voter list maintenance across the country. In states that are attempting to comply with federal law, like Indiana, activist groups are suing to keep maintenance from being done. In states that are not participating, activist groups are suing to force the process. Performing voter list maintenance is the law according to the NVRA. This law was a compromise that required voter registrations to be available at government offices, such as the BMV, and voter list maintenance to be performed. We enforce the registration portion of the law uniformly, but not the voter list maintenance piece. So I encourage Congress to clarify this expectation for the states. And I congratulate and commend the efforts of state officials around the country who are continuing to work hard in the face of this uncertainty. The last piece I want to include is that our office does participate in the Interstate Crosscheck program to assist voter list maintenance, and I'm happy to explain how this works in Indiana if need be. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Secretary Lawson. The chair will now recognize Mr. Ho for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Harper, Ranking Member Brady, and members of this committee. Thank you for holding this hearing and for the opportunity to testify today. The right to vote is the cornerstone of our democracy, and we at the ACLU seek to protect it on equal terms for all Americans. But you can't vote if you're not on the rolls. And voter list accuracy, therefore, requires ensuring that eligible voters are able to get on the lists, that they are not erroneously purged, and that thinning the rolls only occurs when people are or become ineligible to vote. Unfortunately, as described in my written testimony and as is referenced by Ranking Member Brady and Congressman Raskin, erroneous list maintenance efforts in states like Florida, Ohio, and Texas have wrongfully targeted thousands of voters for removal from the rolls. In one incident in Madison County, Mississippi, 10,000 voters were illegally purged just days before an election, including David Landrum, a Republican candidate for what is now Chairman Harper's district. Just yesterday, my home city of New York acknowledged wrongfully purging about 114,000 voters in advance of last year's presidential primary. So this problem is not limited to any region or party. Our registration systems should, of course, be modernized to better account for people who move. And that's why 10 states, most recently Representative Davis's home state of Illinois, on a bipartisan basis, adopted a system of automatic registration, which ensures that unregistered voters are registered and updates rolls when voters move. It's an innovation that both maintains accuracy and helps voters participate without unnecessary bureaucratic hurdles. Now, Secretary Lawson has referenced the interstate voter registration cross-check system, which purports to compare voter rolls in multiple states. And with due respect to the Secretary, we advise against cross-check, which a team of researchers at Stanford, Harvard, UPenn, and Microsoft found misidentifies supposed double voters more than 99% of the time. Crosscheck's user manual itself states, quote, "A significant number of apparent double votes are false positives," and therefore states including Florida, Oregon, and Washington have dropped out of the program altogether. We sometimes also hear suggestions to compare state voter rolls to the Department of Homeland Security's Systematic Alien Verification for Entitlements, or SAVE database. But citing concerns about accuracy, courts have struck down list maintenance efforts involving SAVE in states like Iowa and Florida, where bad matching protocols led the state of Florida to mistakenly designate thousands of Americans as non-citizens, including Bill Internicola, a Brooklyn-born World War II veteran who had fought at the Battle of the Bulge. Now, as you know, on June 28th, the Department of Justice requested information on list maintenance from 44 states, a sweeping inquiry that Vinita Gupta, former head of DOJ's Civil Rights Division and now president of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, has described as, quote, virtually unprecedented. The timing of this request is also suspect, coming on the same day as an infamous demand by the Presidential Commission on Election Integrity for all 50 states' voter rolls. Stockpiling huge amounts of voters' personal data in this manner raises significant cybersecurity concerns. The Commission's plans have been described as a, quote, hacker's goldmine by cybersecurity experts. And this week, it was reported that passwords for crosscheck have been disseminated via email to dozens of people at a time, a risky practice that could permit unauthorized access to voter data from 30 states. Given that dozens of states' registration systems were victims of attempted cyber attacks last year, these plans are risky at best. But I want to emphasize that, as Secretary Lawson said at a Senate Intelligence Committee hearing last year, there is no indication that vote counting was manipulated last year. And as Representative Walker stated last year, there are cases from time to time that need to be investigated, but there is, quote, no mass conspiracy of voter fraud going on. Although we face threats, our elections are secure. Now, unfortunately, we as Americans increasingly seem to refuse to accept the basic legitimacy of our political opponents on the assumption that their electoral support must be the result of fraud. Suggestions along these lines, like the president's false statement that millions of illegal votes cost him the popular vote, do a disservice to men and women who have risked their lives for our democracy. People like my grandfather, Raimundo Sena Estacion, and other Filipino veterans who, as we speak during this hearing, are being awarded the Congressional Gold Medal in Emancipation Hall for their service in World War II. I therefore urge this committee to facilitate participation by encouraging states to adopt systems that automatically update voters' registration information along the lines of Ranking Member Brady's bill, to reject plans that purge eligible voters from the rolls, to help ensure that votes are counted accurately by supporting state efforts to enhance cybersecurity systems. Our democracy is more vibrant and more truly representative when more Americans participate. Thank you.
I want to thank each of you for your testimony and for starting this hearing on what we know is a very essential and important subject. And I want to again thank you both for taking the time to be here. We now have the opportunity for our committee members to ask each of you questions. Each member is allotted 5 minutes to questions the witnesses. To help us keep track of our time, we've got the same light in front of us that you can't see to keep us on track. And I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purposes of asking those questions. If I could, Mr. Ho, just to kind of follow up on the Mississippi example that you gave from Madison County, Mississippi, most of which is in my district, some in Congressman Thompson's district. And it's my understanding, of course, that approximately 10,000 voters were purged from the rolls about 2 weeks before the election. But to clear that up, I want to commend our Secretary of State, Delbert Hosemann, whose staff worked well and very hard to make sure that was corrected, and it was corrected in time for the election. So there was no impact because it was detected. Is that correct?
That's my understanding as well, that Secretary Hosemann understood that this was an illegal purge because it was being conducted
within 90 days.
Election, exactly, and that his staff worked overtime to make sure that those voters were restored to the rolls. So it's a testament to the hard work of his office that no voters were disenfranchised as a result of that illegal purge.
And that is that's something we certainly commend his staff, and they continue to do a great job on making sure that we do those things. Secretary Lawson, in your experience, what impact would you say that inaccurate voter registration lists might have on the lines at polling locations? That seems to be the big story a lot of times on why people walk away, is maybe the lines are too lengthy.
Well, I think it can make a difference. Obviously, we want to make sure that the voters that show up to vote are able to vote. But I think what it does more than increase the time to vote, it increases the process time. So it's the time that the poll workers have to process someone when we have an inaccurate list to help that person with an individual request. That's where the lines get longer.
Discussing coming up with how to make sure the list, and look, I understand, a voter list is never going to be 100% accurate. We get that. There's always going to be things that happen and take place. But what impact would accurate voter registration lists have on the cost of your administering elections?
Well, you know, counties have to send to each voting location the correct number of machines, supplies, ballots, have the right amount of poll workers, and all of that costs money. So if the lists are inflated, it can make a difference. But I think because of the light of all of the things that we've heard about election security and integrity, what it probably does as well is that it takes away money that could be spent by local election jurisdictions on security and integrity of our elections.
You know, I know that when we're looking at the law in Title 52, Section 21083A3 says the appropriate state or local office shall provide adequate technological security measures to prevent the unauthorized access to the computerized list established under this section. So we're not only discussing getting to an accurate list, but also the protection of that and cybersecurity threats. Are you satisfied that those measures are being taken and followed in your state?
Regarding cybersecurity?
Yes.
I think across the country, secretaries are spending hours every day on cybersecurity, and there are a number of activities going on. My legislature has been supportive, luckily, in Indiana, for us to take a number of steps to improve our election security.
And I'm sure that is a major topic when you have your meetings for the National Association of Secretaries of State.
That's correct. The National Association has a number of meetings. We've developed our own cybersecurity task force. We're a member of the Government Coordinating Council for DHS to make sure that we do everything we can to increase the security of our elections.
Right. Explain to us what is Indiana's voter list maintenance policy and who is responsible for it?
Well, in Indiana, it's a bipartisan effort. We have our Indiana Election Division, where we have a bipartisan attorney and director. It's the counties that make the decision whether or not a voter record should be removed, and that's a bipartisan county election board as well. And then the Indiana General Assembly appropriates the money, and those are bipartisan votes as well, so that we can afford, the state can do that mailing on behalf of the counties.
You know, those bipartisan election boards or election commissioners, whatever they may be in various states, that is probably the most thankless job that's out there. And so for the record, I want to thank all the hardworking people that do make sure that they do their best effort on that, and that's a lot of work. So thank you each for your answers. Chair will now recognize Mr. Brady for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I said earlier, I introduced the automatic voter registration bill for the last few Congresses. The Brennan Center estimated my proposal could add 50 million voters to the rolls. Could both of you comment on this idea generally? Ladies first.
Indiana does not have automatic voter registration, but we've done a number of things over the years to increase access. For an example, our indianavoters.com, we have an outward-facing online voter registration. Voters do get asked at the BMV, at our Bureau of Motor Vehicles, we call it, if they want to register to vote. We just passed some laws that increase that participation with our BMV. And I am not, I apologize, Mr. Brady, I have not been aware of your bill.
That's okay. A lot of people haven't been. Mr. Ho.
If I may, and thank you, Ranking Member Brady, for introducing that legislation. We're generally supportive of the idea of automatic registration. We think this is a way to accomplish both the goals of making sure that the registration lists are accurate and as up-to-date as possible, while at the same time increasing access and facilitating participation for more Americans. 10 states have adopted some form of automatic registration. This includes states that are sometimes called red, sometimes called blue, states like Alaska, West Virginia, and as I mentioned in my opening remarks, most recently Illinois signed into law by a Republican governor. So we think it is a good idea. We think it's very important that those systems have adequate safeguards to ensure that people who are ineligible to vote don't become automatically registered. That doesn't do good for either elections or for those people themselves. But as long as those safeguards are built in, we think that these systems are generally a good idea.
How would such a proposal fit into proper list maintenance so that tragedies like what happened in Ohio will not happen again?
Well, if you had a situation like that, then programs like Ohio's, the one that you referenced in your remarks, and which we at the ACLU have been litigating, that case is set to go to the Supreme Court 2 weeks from today, programs like Ohio's would be unnecessary. I mean, Ohio is a really extreme outlier. They treat a person, if you do not vote in a 2-year period, they treat that as evidence that you may have moved, and not just moved, but moved out of the country, I'm sorry, out of the county or out of the state, and become ineligible on that basis. Now, in our midterm elections, typically more than half of registered voters don't participate. So that's an awfully heroic assumption on the part of the state of Ohio. And fortunately, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit agreed with us last year, and 7,500 people were able to vote as a result of the ruling we got. But if you had an automatic system that updated people's registration statuses when they interacted with the state, then maybe overzealous programs like Ohio's would no longer be necessary.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, all my bill does is expand motor voter. Social Security offices, food stamps offices, city, state agencies, that it gives the people an opportunity to let them know that they will check a box and they can get a registration and vote automatically right there. It just allows more people to participate in our democratic system. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Brady yields back. Chair will now recognize Mr. Davis, Vice Chairman of the committee.
Thank you, Chairman. Madam Secretary, first, just a quick question. You know, we hear a lot in elections about voter turnout. Do accurate voter registration lists help you as a Secretary of State depict better turnout models?
Well, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I believe it does. Indiana did voter list maintenance starting in 2014, but we weren't able to complete it until after the 2016 general election cycle. The maintenance that we did this year would have actually given us a 65% turnout rather than a 58% turnout. And I think that encourages the voters to be a part of the group of people who are active voters and do turn out to vote.
Thank you very much. You know, as Mr. Ho mentioned, my home state of Illinois just implemented automatic voter registration. We've had motor voter. Now, I want to ask you about sharing that information between states. If a resident of Illinois moves to Indiana, do your 2 states or do all states effectively share this information with the DMV to ensure that those individuals aren't registered in both states?
It's my understanding that it's really and truly the information that the voter gives. So I believe that every state will ask, what is your previous address? And if the voter states that correctly, then that state is notified. But if the voter doesn't give the information, the states don't get it. They can't share it.
Mr. Ho, how many counties do you think nationwide maybe have more than 100% registered on their voter rolls?
I don't have the specific number in front of me, Representative Davis, but I think what I should note is that sometimes assertions about there being more registered voters than total population or adult population in a particular county are exaggerations. PolitiFact, for instance, looked at an assertion by the Public Interest Legal Foundation that Bryan County, Georgia—
Actually, if I could, I want to stick to the numbers. Do you have any estimate of how many counties you think would reach that, regardless of whether or not having more than 100%? We can have that debate later, but I don't have enough time. I mean, I've got a report or a letter here from the American Civil Rights Union that says 200 counties, over 200 counties nationwide. That doesn't sound like much when you look at our country, right? But I've got from the Illinois State Board of Elections that 24 of 102 counties in my home state have more than 100% registered in their county, more so than their population that's eligible to vote. So with that being said, And especially now that we have automatic voter registration, I mean, what would you recommend our states do, our State Board of Elections in Illinois, Secretary of State in Indiana, and others, to make sure that no one is eligible to vote in two jurisdictions and therefore can't do some of the things that we've seen voters unfortunately do in the past? Prime example of misusing voting privileges would have been one of the previous secretaries of state in the state of Indiana. So obviously, I think we need to be better prepared. So what do you recommend we do?
Well, I guess I would say three things to that, Representative Davis. The first is just to take a step back and look at what those numbers actually signify. So when you say that there are more voters in a jurisdiction than people, a lot of times those counts include people who are designated as inactive registrants, which means they are in the process of being removed from the roll. So PolitiFact, for instance, rated a claim that Bryan County, Georgia had more registered voters than adults as false, and gave it that inaccurate rating. But the second thing I would say is, in principle, there's nothing wrong with the idea of sharing information across state lines. You just have to make sure that the underlying data is accurate and that your matching protocols don't generate false positives. And unfortunately, the cross-check system, which we hear referenced frequently, suffers from flaws in both of those regards.
Well, do you think this 100%, more than 100% voter registration in certain counties, regardless of the justification, is it Bryan County, Georgia? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Is that your district, Barry? Oh, okay. But regardless of that, I mean, don't you think the negative stories impact voter confidence? I mean, wouldn't it be better to be able to say, hey, we've got 65% turnout, this is record turnout in the state of Indiana? Because in the end, don't we all want everyone who's eligible to vote to vote?
Of course we want as much turnout as possible. Our democracy is better off when more Americans
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I guess what I don't get is, how can we work together to make sure that we put better systems in place, especially with the institution of automatic voter registration in my home state? What can we do to work together just to make it better so that we know everybody who is eligible to vote can, and those who are not can't do it more than once?
Well, I would agree with you that we need to make our voter registration systems more accurate and more modern. And I think the automatic system that you just adopted in Illinois, I mean, it's just been signed into law, so it hasn't had the opportunity to go to work yet. I think that's a very good first step towards making progress in that area.
Well, I look forward to working with you and the ACLU and making sure that we implement standards while this new process is being put in place to ensure that they're the most accurate voter rolls. So thank you very much. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair will now recognize Mr. Raskin for 5 minutes for the purposes of asking questions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much, and thank you both for your fine testimony. Mr. Ho, you testified that there was this study done by researchers at Stanford and UPenn, some other universities, and Microsoft, which found that the cross-check program, which is being used by a lot of states, would eliminate about 200 voter registrations used to cast legitimate votes for every one registration used to cast a double vote. Can you explain why that's the case? And then I've got a follow-up on that.
Sure. I'm not an expert myself in computer database matching efforts, but my understanding is that the cross-check system, the criteria that are employed for matching people, are very loose. So for instance, cross-check treats people as a match when their first name, last name, and date of birth are matches. But even when there's other information in the state's records, say a middle name, a social security number, that does not match, and that indicates that we're in fact not talking about the same person.
Okay, so and that mirrors what I was talking about happened in Florida, and I remember being scandalized by the wide net that was cast to purge legitimate voters from the rolls. Do you want to say anything about the potential for the disproportionate effect of that on minority communities? Because I saw some census data which shows that minorities are overrepresented in 85 of the 100 most common last names where we're most likely to have confusion. So if your name is Washington, there's an 89% chance that you're African American. If your last name is Hernandez, there's a 94% chance you're Hispanic. If your last name is Kim, there's a 95% chance you're Asian. So what's the effect in those communities if you cast a wide net and it's enough to have a birthday and a first and last name match as opposed to adding in Social Security information, addresses, and so on?
What you've referenced is my understanding as well, that when you have loose matching criteria amongst state voter lists to try to identify potential double registrants, you end up with false positives that disproportionately affect communities of color.
Gotcha. Okay. So, Madam Secretary, let me ask you, back to the initial kind of philosophical puzzle I started with, how many legitimate voters is it worth disenfranchising to catch one actual double registration in 2 different states?
I don't think we want to catch it, take anyone off the rolls that shouldn't be off the rolls, that doesn't have an inaccurate record. I will tell you, as it regards to the cross-check program that
Yes.
Indiana participates, we developed a software program where we have a confidence level. So if the first name and the last name matches, that's 15 points, 15 points. If the middle name is exactly the same, that's another number of points. And until it reaches 75% or 75 points of confidence, our bipartisan county election boards don't even get the information. And ultimately, they are the ones that are making.
Can you give me the other point scorings that you have there? I mean, so how much is it for first name and last name and middle name?
There are a number. We use first name, we use last name, we use middle name, obviously, a suffix, whether it's an initial for the middle name only. I can't remember exactly how many points, but I can certainly provide it to you after this testimony. I think I have that information.
But does that mean?
But it's driver's license number, it's social security number.
But let me just see if I can understand it. This is complicated stuff. So if I find on one list, say, a Connie Meredith Lawson, and I find another list, a Connie Julia Lawson, the one way of doing it is say, well, the middle names don't match. We'll keep that person on the rolls. But you're saying I could continue to accumulate points that would disqualify that person?
No, if the middle name doesn't match, I don't believe that would reach that level.
Even if you had the other requisite number of points?
Yes, yes.
So in other words, you get to that number of points, and then there are certain disqualifying, irreconcilable information that would then remove that from the potential of a purge?
I can tell you if it doesn't reach a 75-point confidence level, it doesn't even go to the county officials. They never see it.
So
we worked with a statistician who told us that if the way we were doing our work, that I would have a better chance of winning the lottery than the counties removing the wrong person, the way we were doing our confidence.
Okay, so all right, well, we definitely have to get to the bottom of that because that's clearly contrary to that finding by those other researchers who said, you know, in 99% of the cases, under a cross-check disqualification system, you're going to get false positives. So, but you're saying reaching the 75 points in Indiana is necessary, but it's not sufficient for removal from the rolls? Is
That's
that right?
correct.
Okay. Could you provide us more detailed information
Absolutely.
on precisely
I can do
the point scoring system you have? And is that the system that's used in all of the jurisdictions that
That's what we use in
cross-check?
Indiana. I can't answer for the other states.
Okay, and was that something that was provided by Crosscheck, or that was something that you guys
That's
came up
something
with?
that we developed, sir.
In the Secretary of State's office?
Yes.
With the
Well, the
statistician?
election division, our bipartisan election division.
Okay, very good. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair will now recognize the gentlelady from Virginia, Ms. Comstock, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Appreciate the hearing topic, and I know, you know, a lot of times we have anecdotes and things, and people make statements, you know, publicly about false voting and all, but I wanted to bring a specific case to mind because it was something that happened in my very own precinct. We had 2 voters who moved from my precinct in 2011, late 11 or so, early 2012, and moved from Virginia to Maryland. And 2012 was a presidential election. Maryland was not going to be a swing state or competitive state. Virginia was. These people came back, and they registered to vote at a friend's house on the same street. Now, as it happened, a woman on the same street also was an election officer in 2012. So when she got the election rolls and saw that the couple, who she knew because it had been a neighbor for years, was now registered at a new house on the street, that she knew they were not living in because she lived down the street and knew that was somebody else's house. She looked at that and said, well, this is strange. They moved out of, say, I'm making up the number, but she moved out of 100 Smith Street and came back and registered to 105 Smith Street, and the election officer happened to live on 110 Smith Street and knew they weren't living there. So when she went to be the election officer on election day and this couple came in, she said, hey, you don't live here. Why are you coming in to vote? And they said, oh no, we're homeless. We are living at Jeff's house, and we're still looking for a house. So they ended up being allowed to vote because you challenged them, and they didn't even have to vote in a contested vote. They got to vote because they said they had their election card because they had gone and fraudulently registered to vote at this other person's house, even though they had their residence in Maryland. So Virginia has elections every year. So before the 2013 race came about, people in the neighborhood, because there were other people who knew this had happened, got information showing they had newcomer, they had gone to, they were in a newcomer newsletter in Maryland. They were living in Annapolis. They weren't living on the street. Numerous people on the street said, they're not living here. Some stories got written up about it. This was all brought to the attention of the election board in our county, who then wrote up this fraudulent report and sent it to the prosecutors, who declined to prosecute. So I guess I would ask you both, now, because this got so much attention, because these letters were publicized, because these letters were written, and because they were identified by name by numerous neighbors on the street, as well as by the person whose house they were living in, who was a local Democrat activist, they did not show up to vote in 2013, which, given I was on the ballot, I was very appreciative of that. But what laws on the books or not on the books how do we get that type of case to not, and I guess maybe I'll direct it to Mr. Ho, what would you say we should do in that case? Because I think it was a pretty clear case of fraud. They weren't living on that street or in that neighborhood anymore, yet they were allowed to vote in 2012. And I'll tell you, I was in the House of Delegates at that time. That district came out exactly tied between Obama and Romney. So then when I was in 2013, it wasn't exactly tied. I had, but it was a close election. So we're talking about a lot of close elections here, which is why they obviously wanted to vote here. What do you think we should do in those type of cases? And how, when you had a prosecutor who just wouldn't prosecute, what could we do to correct that?
Thank you for the question, Representative Comstock. So I'm not an expert in law enforcement. I'm not familiar with the details of that case and why the prosecutor in that case declined to bring charges. It may very well be the case that whatever evidence was adduced was insufficient to meet the standards for probable cause for an indictment. I guess I would say this, is that no one's denying that there aren't cases from time to time that merit investigation and prosecution, as Representative Walker, who's not with us right now, has said. But what we don't have is a substantial pattern of evidence of widespread fraud. We do have evidence that overenthusiastic purges have removed legitimate voters from the rolls. And I guess what I would say is that when we're trying to balance these concerns, let's go where the evidence leads us. Let's make decisions based on that evidence and do a cost-benefit analysis here. And if we have evidence that these purges are overzealous, maybe we shouldn't be talking about doing more purging. Maybe we should be talking about doing less and more accurate purging.
Or maybe more prosecution in terms of looking at that. Would that help in terms of, so that you're not purging as much as you are saying this, maybe having more information available? Because one of the, we didn't have the Maryland rolls available, did they? Actually, we were able, people were able to look into that and see they hadn't yet registered in Maryland because obviously they wanted to continue to vote in Virginia because there were closer elections in Virginia, and they, I think there's clearly a problem here, and I can tell you, since this was very, people kept coming to us saying, they can't show up to vote. I mean, you can imagine the neighbors who were sitting there watching them, the frustration of just having them bold-facedly lie to them about living on their street when they didn't. So, that obviously, it's beyond anecdote. And so I think wherever we can highlight real fraud and make sure there's a response to it, it would be helpful.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair will now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank both of the witnesses for being here today. Secretary Lawson, first of all, thank you for your service. I know that sometimes that can be a thankless job, especially when you're dealing in the voters and voter registration, and especially with the myriad of laws and regulations and procedures, and we often don't make it easy on you to do your job. Let me ask you a quick question. Do you know or do you believe that there is duplicativeness between voter rolls in various states? For instance, that there are people registered in one state and they're registered in another state?
I'm sure that's the case, sir. It's not, voters don't think about changing or canceling their voter registration in one state when they move to another, and it's certainly not against the law to be registered in more than one state. But it's against the law to vote in more than one state. And so, yes, I'm sure that's the case.
Okay. Mr. Ho, do you know that there duplicativeness between states and their voter rolls?
I mean, news reports came out, I think, after the election that various members of the president's, for example, cabinet and inner circle, like Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, former advisor Steve Bannon, former press secretary Sean Spicer, were all registered to vote in more than one state last year. But no one accused them of fraud or anyone committing any kind of fraudulent activity in their names.
Okay. But so you take that news report as valid that they're, I mean, you're referencing a news report as statement that you do believe that this is the case?
I don't have any reason to doubt the veracity of
Okay.
those reports.
Well, just you kind of dispelled other news reports as invalid, and I just want to make sure that you're not trying to justify a particular end that we're taking. I'm living in a world of reality. Let me share with you this, and I have some other questions. I particularly know of 3 people that were registered in 3 different states simultaneously. They didn't know that they should cancel. It's not their responsibility. I think it's the responsibility of the states. So I asked one of them, because they work construction, they traveled, and a lot of times you live in, if you're doing a project that lasts for a year, you'll move there and you'll live in Virginia for a year, then you'll move to Florida for a year, and then you go home to your home state of Texas for a while or whatever. And I asked one of them, with an election coming up, are you going to go home in time for the election? They said, I'm just going to vote right here. I said, did you change your residency? He said, no, I just registered to vote in this state. I said, so did you cancel registration? No, I actually voted in the municipal election back in my home state when I was there a few months ago. Now, this is somebody who is actually registered in 3 different states and out of convenience is just going to go vote from whatever state that they live in. So I know for a fact, in at least 3 instances, and I'm sure in my small group of folks that I know that people would tell me that there has got to be multiple individuals that fall in that category. Now, I do have issues with this automatic registration. I had issues with motor voter when it was put in, because I come from an IT background. And there's one thing about, in the information technology arena, a rule we live by: if you don't have the data, you don't have to protect it. And we're living in an age right now. I just came out of a hearing in Science and Technology where it is suspected that Russia is using a U.S. company to mine American intelligence information off personal computers. We live in a very dangerous role. And automatic voter registration that's going to register somebody who may not even know they were registered to vote, may not even know that their information is out there on a database, and who may never, ever exercise their right to vote, really puts those people at risk. I think voting is a responsibility, and you need to make an effort to go vote. Now, that was my statement for the day. Question to Ms. Lawson. Are there mandates in the NVRA that make it difficult for secretaries such as yourself to run an effective list maintenance program?
I believe that the requirement to mail 2 mailings to an individual is an impediment As I mentioned, our counties couldn't afford to do it themselves as required by law, so the state took that over. It might be nice if there was just one mailing that was required, and it would be a forwardable postcard with that. There are other things that we could take advantage of as states if we were allowed to. I think my state takes advantage of some tools that the federal government gives us. We do the state and territorial exchange of vital events in case somebody who lives on the border of our state goes to Kentucky and dies in a hospital there. We get that information. We get the EVE information. But there's other information that the federal government could give us that would help us as well.
Mr. Chairman, can I have another 30 seconds for a follow-up?
Yes, sir.
So we do know that there are times that we do need to remove somebody from a database. In fact, I think it's the responsibility for that person's personal information security that we do that. Knowing that there could be mistakes made, what safeguards does Indiana have to make sure their voters do not have their voter registration inaccurately canceled? And if a voter is in an inactive status, can they still cast a provisional ballot?
I appreciate the question, and the answer is, if the voter status is inactive when they show up the polls, it's transparent to them and to the poll worker. So they're allowed to vote if they're in the inactive status. If they have been removed and because they didn't respond to the 2 mail pieces and they didn't vote and they were removed, but they decided in 2016 they wanted to show up and vote, according to NVRA, all they have to do is give an oral affirmation that they have never moved from that address, and they are allowed to vote a regular ballot, not a provisional ballot.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back the time I have exceeded.
Gentleman yields back. Okay. As a follow-up on that, real quick, if they're not on the inactive, but they say that I'm supposed to be able to vote here, they still cast a provisional ballot, and then the election board reviews that to see if it should be counted or not, or they just escort it out?
Depends on the circumstances, but I know in Indiana, the instructions that we give is that no voter is to be turned away. If their name is removed through a voter list maintenance effort, and it should not have been, they can make an oral affirmation and still vote. If it's for some other reason that they're not there, they can vote provisionally, and that gives then the county 10 days to deal with that issue.
Great. Thank you, both of you, for being here. This is certainly a very vital subject, and your insight is much appreciated. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit to the chair additional written questions for the witnesses, which we will forward and ask the witnesses to respond as promptly as they can so that their answers may be made a part of the record. Without objection, this hearing is adjourned.